a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, rebels, iconoclasts, self-believers, and self-makers. I'm Grant Faulkner, and we're here today to celebrate those parts of ourselves that others have held in disdain or disrespect, those parts of ourselves that we've had difficulty expressing in a world that might be outright cruel to us, and those parts of ourselves that we've, been made to feel are shameful or that should remain hidden or should be corrected even. And I bet we've all felt all of that to some degree at some time, and then I know some of us have felt these things to an extreme. I'm with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, we're celebrating these often hidden parts of ourselves that we're made to be shameful of, because today's guest, Prabal Gurang, who is a famous fashion designer, but he was ridiculed mercilessly as a child for walking like a girl. That's the operating metaphor here. But he embraced that supposed inadequacy and has claimed it as a source of strength. So much so that the title of his new book is Walk Like a Girl, his new memoir. And it struck me while reading this book that so much of our great art comes from people who have been deeply wounded as children, but who overcome that wound through their art. And so I'm curious, Brooke, if you were ever teased like this as a child, or witnessed to a child being teased for something so kind of central to their identity, or if not, if you have just kind of any memoirs to recommend that deal directly with overcoming bullying and ostracization like this.
Yeah, gosh, it makes me think kids are so awful to each other. And yes, I don't know if you can get out of childhood without being teased. I wouldn't say it was to the level of being a core wound. But two of the main things I remember being teased for: my name, I think just because it rhymes with a lot of things like Brooke the Crook and Brooke the Hook. And I remember getting teased also for having big lips. I also remember that my dad told me that someday I'd be grateful when I got older. And he was right, but I don't think that made me feel all that great in elementary school. But these are minor, like I said. I mean, I was not ostracized, and I certainly remember kids at school who were, for just not fitting in because of their social awkwardness, their weight, any number of factors that makes a kid weird or uncool or different. And, we were at the Bay Area Book Festival recently, Grant, and I saw a panel with Viet Thanh Nguyen, and he had a funny quip about having the requisite childhood trauma that allowed him to grow up to become a writer. And I don't know, in fact, whether Viet was bullied, but I do know that Ocean Vuong was, and he touches upon this, of course, in his autofictional story, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And I know there are many other coming-of-age memoirs that talk about being bullied as a kid. And I also want to note that bullying impacts whole family systems, whole communities. She Writes Press published a really powerful memoir in 2022 called Canaries Among Us. And the subtitle is Parenting at the Intersection of Bullying, Neurodiversity, and Mental Health. And the author is Kayla Taylor. And that book was by the mother of a child who was bullied for being different. So much so that they had to change schools. And so it's what happened, both to the family, but also within the school system. And so I will give a shout out to that. But I'm curious, Grant, how about you? What was your experience of all of this?
Yeah, I guess my experience was very fortunately similar to yours in that I was mainly teased, for things like my name, which also rhymed with things. But I was bullied a bit in middle school. There was one guy, and this bewilders me to remember it, but he waited for me at this one spot in between classes every day, and he picked on me kind of as he wasn't stealing my lunch money, but it kind of feels like that, but he picked on me kind of physically and mentally. And yeah, I can't remember what it was truly about. So I don't think it damaged me psychologically in any truly deep way, but I was fearful of him and was kind of, cowering every day as I walked in that direction, because he just kind of like waited for me. But I feel like to exist back then was to be teased at that stage of growing up. And it was, definitely damaging to some degree, because at that age, we perhaps have a greater need to fit in and be accepted, or we're just more deeply afraid of being ostracized, or I hope we are, than we are as adults. I was thinking about this because when I was in high school, I encountered the Greek Delphic maxim, know thyself. And when I first read it, it was presented as a kind of key to life, that if you know yourself, you'll have a strong happiness because you'll be comfortable in your own skin. You'll be less likely to feel peer pressure or be needy for love and more resilient, I think. And it sounds so easy, know thyself, but it's really one of the the toughest things, because I think ourselves, we keep changing as life changes, and even in the course of a single day. And we might stand up for ourselves one moment and then compromise ourselves in the next, or feel ashamed in the next, especially if we're looking for approval from a boss or a coworker or a new friend. And then our brains are actually wired to seek acceptance, to want to be part of the group, and I think that's for evolutionary reasons, because survival is more likely if we're part of a group. And if you're being ostracized and stigmatized, then that literally hurts. So the other part of know thyself, I think, is to be thyself, which is super hard to do. And we talked recently in a recent episode about my Substack on the topic of creative defiance. And you mentioned the quote I used from Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And she says, literature is strewn with the wreckage of those who have minded beyond reason the opinion of others. And that's the crux of it, I think, is minding the opinion of others and seeking validation. And that's obviously not only a part of being a human being, but being a writer. And, when I look back on my life, perhaps the period I'm most proud of is my 2 years of teen rebellion. And I say that because that was the one period of my life when I not only didn't mind the opinions of others, like I actively disregarded it and even disdained them. And I was living in a very conservative culture that I found maddening and unfair and just unimaginative and unjoyful. So I took pleasure in disrupting things and not fitting in just for the sake of not fitting in. And that's why I loved punk rock as a teen, because being against the world was a way for me to be myself. And there are many things that I did back then that I don't exactly respect now. But I think that by being a rebel then, I learned how being a rebel could serve me at times. And I can turn to that side of myself as a source of strength when I need to. Because we all face a world that wants us to fit in or doesn't like the way we move. Essentially a world that tells us we walk like a girl and that's wrong. So Prabal says that, this is a quote from his book, true freedom comes from the letting go of needing validation from the outside world. So curious, do you have any periods like mine when you had to find a different side of yourself just to stick up for yourself, and be yourself and let go of validation from the outside world?
I think when you talk about it, it was mostly true for me when I was in my 20s and coming into my feminism. I fell in love with my ex-wife, and I wrestled with what that meant for me and my identity. And it did take me a while to fully own being a lesbian. A lot of that had to do with questions of validation, like, are you okay with who you are? And how much do you care about what other people think? And what's wild to me is that I'm 20 years past that experience. And most of us don't conform to whatever baseline standard we're measuring ourselves against, like some sort of ideal of whiteness or straightness or prettiness or thinness. My brother said something interesting to me when he was in his 40s about wishing that he'd known, basically he said something to the effect of none of that shit mattered when he was a kid. And I think mainly for him, it was about not dating in high school, that he saw himself as a nerdy kid or a kid who couldn't get girls. And now he's married to his amazing wife, my sister-in-law, and has been for years. And the point that I took from his comment is that when you're in whatever you're in, and you feel like you don't belong or you're on the outside or you're not good enough or whatever, sometimes you can't see past your very small bubble of existence to a bigger world that's possible for you. And of course, like for a lot of us, that's just about embracing your otherness, whatever that otherness is. And you will find your place, but not always while you're growing up and confined to the experience of your town, your school, your family. And I think about this so much, Grant, because of kids and mental health. Sometimes I just want to say to kids who are struggling, like, just get past high school, because our kids, they are struggling, and our culture really makes it hard for them when they don't fit into like a perfect box of whatever normal is.
Totally. Just get back to high school, get past the day. It does change. And I think the letting go of validation from the outside world is something, we have to practice every day, even as adults, of course, and remind ourselves to practice. And especially as writers, when Prabal decided to become a fashion designer, there were no fashion designers in Nepal. So people said, people actually told him it's a good hobby, but what do you really want to do? And they told his mother he was indulging in a whimsical fantasy that he, never succeed at. And it, technically, I guess it did seem unlikely for someone from Nepal to break through like he has. But I think there's a common response that people get when they want to be writers as well, or they get, outright discouragement in some cases. And I always say that I can't believe how lucky I was that my parents never discouraged me from being a writer, because there was plenty of societal discouragement. Even though they grew up, poor in the Depression. And in fact, they always, ironically, they seemed proud of me as a writer because of that. And even when I was down and out and didn't have much to show for myself, which was for a long time. So I don't know. It's an interesting lesson that I try to remind myself as a parent. And Prabal has a source of, his source of strength is through his mother, who always stood by him. And that made me think of how much loving support matters for any success, especially if you're wounded. And we often forget that and focus on, overcoming the wound, because in Western culture, we tend to focus on the independent hero. And in reading Prabal's memoir, it's obvious that he just wouldn't be the successful creator he is now without his mother's love. And it's easier to let go of validation when we have the validation of a loved one in your life, even if you are an angry punk rocker. And that might be an interesting collection of essays on the topic of how others' love actually supported success in the arts. I think it's overlooked, especially with writers. So, Brooke, what's your take on having a loving center, even for those practicing outsider art? I guess we're all practicing outsider art by definition, just because making art is somewhat of being an outsider, just outsider pursuit, just to start.
It's interesting. I think that spark of creativity exists equally for those who are lucky enough to have a loving center as for those who don't. I've known writers who've had terribly abusive family units who, they're certainly fueled, informed by their trauma. And then there are people with very loving parents who still have terrible trauma that informs their art. I was thinking about Roxane Gay because she was also at the Bay Area Book Festival recently. And her book, Hungry, discloses her awful experience of being gang raped when she was just 12 years old and how this changed everything for her. But Roxane credits both of her loving, supportive parents and her trauma for who she's become as a feminist and a public intellectual. And so I guess my feeling is that the desire to express emerges from having something to say. It helps for sure if you have that loving center for your own mental health, but I don't think it's necessary at all, or even something that makes a person more or less of an artist. I'm not sure exactly if that's where you were going with this question, but I think, I just want to make sure, I guess I want to make sure that all the listeners feel validated, right? Like no matter where you are an artist.
Yeah, totally. I didn't mean it in that way of saying that one needed a loving center in order to be a successful artist. I guess I was meaning it mostly just in that we celebrate the heroic, independent individual sometimes and overlook the kind of, the network of support that's often around them, which in my case, or in Prabal's case, took the form of his mother in particular. And even though, I felt like an outsider as a teen, I have to say that I had a lot of layers or safety nets of inclusion and acceptance that actually made my rebellion a little easier. So I'm in that same camp as Prabal. But my brother is gay, and I think he often experienced the kind of teasing that Prabal did, because this was essentially 50 years ago in the 70s, and there was no one out of the closet in my small town. And I doubt he ever felt anything like a true sense of belonging there, which just has to be so depressing on a day-to-day level, such a burden to carry for 18 years. So reading Prabal's memoir, brought me closer to imagining his experience and just realizing how every day was so much more fraught with anxiety than mine was. And I mentioned how our brains are wired to seek acceptance. We fundamentally want to belong. And when we don't have a sense of belonging, it's easy to lose our power. It's easy to feel that, we're bad and wrong and shameful, and that can all manifest itself in destructive and dangerous ways. And that's why I'm happy that memoirs like Prabal's exist, because they provide a sense of belonging, a sense of power. And that's one reason we all write as well. So we'll be right back and hear more of Prabal's story right after this short break. Welcome back, everybody. I am delighted to introduce Prabal Gurang, who is a famous fashion designer who is also now a memoirist. His new book, Write Like a Girl, tells the story of his childhood in Singapore and Nepal, his education in India, and his career in the U.S. fashion industry, where he was subjected to racial discrimination, among other things. And a reviewer for Kirkus called the memoir an insightful and entertaining look into the life of a famous fashion designer. But I think it's much more than that. Welcome, Prabal.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate you both.
It's a real treat for us. And I want to begin by exploring the title, Walk Like a Girl. You know, your first epigraph in the book is from Robin Given, who said, "To be girlish is to be powerful because power is redefined." And I love that because you embraced part of yourself that you were made to feel shame about, but you flipped it to be a strength. And I read that you actually decided way back in 12th grade that you'd one day write a book, and you even decided then to use Walk Like a Girl as the title of your book. So can you introduce the book to our listeners by talking more about what Walk Like a Girl means to you?
To me, the term Walk Like a Girl is just not a title, it's a reclamation. It's a reclamation of a phrase, often used pejoratively. So I wanted to take that term and transform it into a term of perceived weakness, into a symbol of strength, resilience, and empowerment. Really, to walk like a girl to me is to move through the world with courage and softness, defiance and grace, power and vulnerability, and above all, with an unapologetic joy that says, "I belong here." And to love, to love unabashedly, unconditionally, wholeheartedly. Because that's how I've lived my life, quite often misunderstood, sometimes mocked, but always on my terms. So I wrote this book as a love letter to femininity in all its form, not as something to rise above, but something to rise with, because the truth is, walking like a girl taught me how to survive and then how to soar. So just growing up, being surrounded by strong women, started with my mother, my sister, and then even my superhero was, Wonder Woman and Charlie's Angels. I never thought walking like a girl was something so offensive or bad. I didn't get it. Even when people used to say, boys used to be like, "Oh, you walk like a girl, you act like a girl." I just didn't understand that emulating women was a sign of weakness because I never saw anything like that. But I understood the intention, the way they said it and the way it landed, and the intention behind it was pretty I got it, that it was not welcoming term, but it was more like, "Oh, you're not one of us." So in that not being one of us at that time, it was painful, it was hard, but when I look back at it, it also freed me from needing to belong. And in that unbelonging, I think I found myself.
That's inspiring, Prabal. Thank you. In your author's note, you say that celebrating feminine-leaning people and quote unquote their authentic, unapologetic existence is the only way to save the world. I agree. Could you speak more to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's always been one of my favorite conversation, topic or discussions to have with friends and, let's say, like-minded people and people who don't see eye to eye also, whether it's over cocktail or dinner. Because I've had this conversation over the period of time, simply because we all grew up in this world, and the world is still that way, where absolute brute power is the one that is celebrated. When we equate success or something like that, it's always large buildings, success at any cost, capitalism. It doesn't matter how you get there, as long as you have the money, and all that's a perceived sign of success and wealth that is often for the outside world to say wow, right? I've always believed that is not, to me, that has never been the sign of success. I've always believed community. When I talk about the feminine leaning ideas, it's very much heart-led. It's very much thought-led. It's very deeply rooted in empathy and seeing each other. It is very community-driven. It's very collaborative. It is not an isolated endeavor where all you think about is yourself and that's it. It is about the impact that you create. It is about who you're bringing along. And that's when I think about feminine leaning people, that's what I mean. It's not so much of a gender. It is the idea that you see other people as a collaborative partner rather than a competition that you have to trample over it. And it simply started because I think it was because of my mother. My mother was you have to be really good at what you do. But at the same time, you have to define your own version of success. And you also have to understand that curiosity and saying, "I don't know, may I learn," is the only way to grow. And so, and I remember growing up with my male cousins, and I'd go to their rooms and it would be big posters that would say, "Tigers don't cry," stuff like that. And I was I was like, what? Like, wait, what? I'm like, and meanwhile in our home, we were taught to question things, like just saying I like this or I don't like this was not enough. There was deeper conversation. And then when I came to America, and then not just in America, the patriarchy, the way it performs and masquerades, it is such a caricature of like masculinity, because true masculinity is not about posturing. True masculinity is really bringing everyone along. When I see powerful men, or masculinity in its beautiful form, is really, it again is deeply rooted in collaborative community empathy. So that's where it started from. So like for me, it has been women, it's feminine leaning people, feminine leaning ideas. Like I'll tell you, recently something happened to me. Like, and I was like walking on the street, and this gentleman had read this book, and he was just like, started saying like how much he loved and everything. And he said to me, I want to do good by my son. I want to be the father that your father wasn't, and to like when I was talking to my sister, and I said, listen, people who see eye to eye with me about these topics they're already, in our folds. But if I can change one person, one guy, whether, a person who always had this like narrow idea of like what a parent or a father should be, and now can start questioning it or start thinking in a different way, that is what a job well done is. It's, for me, that's my biggest gift.
Probably it's almost like you were teeing me up for my question in that whole answer, especially the phrase bringing other people along and that mutuality and that collaboration, because Brooke and I were talking about how in Western culture in particular, we so often celebrate the solitary hero, as if it's all on the protagonist to overcome obstacles and reach success independently. And what I found so touching about your story and so moving was that you obviously had a very loving and understanding mother who was very attuned to you and more than tolerant. She wasn't just tolerant, she was supporting of everything you are. So I was wondering if you could talk about the role she played in giving you belonging and love and supporting you as a person, and also, supporting your artistic endeavors, so that, that others were sometimes negative about.
For me, my mother is, she's my blueprint for my strength, and she was the first woman I ever watched carry the weight of the world with like real elegance, watching her build a life for us, my siblings and I, unbowed, unapologetic. It was just, I would say, it was my first lesson in resilience. Then watching her, like, and I learned that elegance is not a posture, but a practice. She taught me that kindness in a form like that is deeply rooted in truth is powerful, and that grace can be an armor. And and that kind of love, that kind of acceptance, that's the kind of community building is the most radical force in the world. So I would say, like, in everything I am today, everything I create is a reflection of her light. She is my North Star. And the thing about her, when I think about like in my mom and her wisdom, it's just not the wisdom that she's, or like an acceptance. It was very simple for her. I asked her, Mom, like, how did you think it was okay for me to wear those dresses, my sister's dresses, and your heels, even though they were big, and makeup and everything? And she said, when I looked at you wearing those dresses and looking at your sister's dresses or in the heels and makeup, the joy on your face, it was something that I'd never seen in anyone. So I could not deny my child that. So, and I didn't even understand there was gender assigned to any of this inanimate objects. So I didn't even think anything about it. So it was as simple. It was not she was trying to be this great person. It was just like she loved her child, saw the happiness, and wanted to bring the happiness. And that's what that parenting is. So, and then with my autistic endeavors and everything, she was just like, till date, she says, success and failures are part of your journey. It is going to bound to happen. It is going to come your way no matter what. Find a middle ground. And more than anything, find something that brings you joy, because life is filled with challenges and on the highs and the lows. And if you can find joy in even little things, especially in what you do and who you hang out with, life gets better and life gets easier. And that's the truth. So my mother is not someone who's like effusive, you're great, you're amazing. She is always like, I'm very happy that you've achieved this. She's always like, is this success, all this stuff that's coming your way, all this attention coming your way, is this just going to be for you? Or how are you going to create an impact? How are you going to share it? And that has always been part of our DNA growing up, and it's just not me. Like, I am the least out of my siblings. My sister and my brother, they do so much quietly without any spotlight on them, without much fanfare. And just like watching them also was my, they're my moral compass, all of them.
Super touching, Prabal. Thank you for sharing all of that. Grant and I always are talking about memoir and the various permutations it takes, and that stems sometimes from painful and difficult memories that you have to confront. And so you have this, beautiful aspect of who your mother is as your moral compass, and yet, some of these really difficult experiences that you essentially relive if you're writing a memoir. And so we wanted to ask you about that part of it. We know that you hadn't taught too much about the relationship between your mother and father, about things that had happened in boarding school, besides, a few family and friends. So what was it like to excavate that in the memoir?
I would say it's the most challenging thing I've ever done in my entire life, because if you're a public person, you kind of learn to navigate especially in today's world where, oftentimes vulnerability it becomes like a capital. You share. So there's like I would say there's a public side to you, then there is the public personal side to you also that people get to see, right? And I think every person in a public forum does that. They will share a little bit of ourselves with the public so they get to connect with us. But there was so much in the book that I hadn't shared with anyone. It was simply because A, it was extremely painful. B, I did not want anyone's pity. I did not want to come across as a victim. I'd survived a lot of these stuff. And sometimes, what, I did not want to be looked at by people like, oh, I'm so sorry for you. You went through all that. We all go through it. So I didn't want that. I don't know. Maybe it was my ego. Maybe it was my self-pride, like whatever it was. So when it came down to writing this, I was like, I don't want to posture. If I'm going to write this, I'm going to write the truth. I'm going to write it as raw as possible. I want to pour it all out because then I will be free of it all. I don't have to pretend anymore. I can just let it out there, and hopefully in this story, people will find themselves, or it resonates with them. So I would say, so to me, like writing this memoir was one of the most vulnerable endeavors I've undertaken. Revisiting those painful memories and confronting past traumas is required immense emotional labor. There were moments of doubt and fear. I don't know if I was ready to share so much of myself. But then I kept on reminding myself that, storytelling is a powerful tool for healing and connection, because that's what I've done through my work in fashion. So by being honest and open, I hope to, I hope to inspire others to embrace their own stories, because sharing stories, telling stories, what I've realized over the period of time is it connects people, it heals people. And I just want people to feel that way. And writing was one aspect. That was still, I would say, pen to paper, kind of writing it down, then typing it. It is still personal, but it's still you're editing all of that stuff, right? So now, when I was recording the book, my goodness, I can't even tell you. It took everything out of me. I had never experienced pain and kind of lack of better word, almost unraveling that I had experienced during that when I was recording it. There was, I would break down and cry. I could not stop it, because here's this thing: when you're reading it, you're reliving it, and by reliving it, it feels like that those scenes just happened right there a second ago, and it is such a surreal experience, and nobody can prepare it for you. So I would say it was the most challenging thing for me. And then, for the longest period of time, I was in my healing, process and journey. And I was, seeing a therapist, talking to, like spiritual healing, all of that stuff, meditation. But then after I finished my audio recording, I realized my healing started now. I had thought I'd done it all, but my healing started now, because now I have put it all out there. Now it was up to be like, all right, you know what? there were so many things. Like, for instance, because I had to keep on moving with my ambition, with my things that I wanted to achieve, family and everything. So I'd never sat down and really addressed so many issues. But when I read those, when I was doing the audio recording, then I looked at that 11-year-old kid, 13-year-old kid. I looked back at it and I was like, wow, I felt angry for him. I felt sad for him. I felt happy for him. I marveled at him, all that stuff. And above all, I realized I'd never given that little boy a hug and saying you'll be okay, because I didn't know then. But now the fact that I could go back and do that to that little kid, if anything that comes out of this book is the gift that has been given to me, is that I could look there and really heal that child. And so it was cathartic. It was emotional. It was worse than breaking up with my boyfriend of 7 years, and it's so it was I would say it was worse than how Elizabeth Bennet felt when Mr. Darcy said, that I'm just like, I was just going through everything, just like, oh my God. And I was like talking to my friends. I was like, oh my God, nobody told me. But, when I look back at it, I'm glad I went through it, because I don't think I could have moved on. And this is the first time in my entire life I felt so free. I felt so free because I no longer need to carry it now.
That is such a story, Prabal, and especially that perspective on your audio recording, which I hadn't really thought about so much. But the way you put that speaking those stories in their immediacy is so different than writing them.
Absolutely.
But I do want to talk a little bit about the writing, because this is a podcast for writers.
Yes.
And we often talk about the writing process. And I'm very curious, some of your passages in the book are just really gorgeous and vividly written. And so I'm just curious if there's any ways that being a fashion designer influenced your words on the page.
What an interesting question. Okay. So when I'm designing a collection, when I sit down with my team, before I sit down with my team, I do a lot of research and a lot of I would say pondering, and the thing that we don't allow ourselves in this modern world is loitering and pondering and gathering, just like thoughts and sitting with your thoughts, whether it's going to the museum, listening, or just walking around. I do that a lot before I get onto sitting down and creating. Then I write down what the world that I want to create in this collection, who this person is, who this woman is. So I create this whole scenario, the feeling and the emotion. So I've always done that. And I've also and I write my journal and all that stuff. So, but I was also not in a delusion that I was this incredible, prolific, amazing writer. All I kept on telling myself was, I want to share a story. I'll write my story. That's all I cared about. And so that freed me from the burden of framing the perfect sentences in the beginning. So I just kind of went with it, I always say this, even in fashion, even in writing, and in life in general, I am in a position, I've always am comfortable in a position of a student rather than a teacher. So I'm always curious, and I'm always unafraid to make mistakes. I'm always be like, listen, this is not my forte. I'm just telling the stories. I'll make mistakes. My grammar might be wrong, or the words that I choose might be wrong, but I'm okay. I'm okay with it, And that level of, I say, lack of delusion there helped me form my sentences, perhaps,
Well, in closing, Prabal, we wanted to ask you about designing. I mean, you've designed for many celebrities, which makes you a celebrity designer, of course. And
God, yeah.
As writers, we're not just commissioned to write stories for specific people like that, right? So I'm curious, what was it like, designing for Oprah, Michelle Obama, or Zoe Saldana?
Oh, my God. Till date, even after all these years, it still feels surreal when somebody says to me, oh, will you make something for me? Do you want something to be made for? I'm always like, oh, wow, amazing, great. I'm always the one who's excited, and then when the opportunities like that come my way, I'm always I don't forget where I started from. Like, I don't forget that I came from this like tiny little country sandwiched between these two giants, India and China, this Nepal, and where there was no designer, no one to look up to, no, no heroes in my field that, I could, follow or something like that. So I kind of created that roadmap on my own, like with obviously, like looking at other designers in different parts of the world. I've never lost that groundedness, like the connection to the dreams that I had back home in Nepal and the opportunity that's coming my way. So when it comes my way, it is gratifying, it is humbling, it is exciting, because here's this thing about designing for all these women that, that inspire me. It's like, it no doubt humbles me every time, and then to see these women I admire, whether it's like, the first ladies or cultural trailblazers, then see them wear my, work it's an indescribable feeling, because more than the clothes, it's about what they represent, the courage, conviction, complexity, which I find really fascinating. And I always say this, I don't design to make women beautiful. They already are. My goal is to design so I can mirror their strength, to celebrate their stories, so I feel like dressing them is not a privilege. It's just a responsibility also, because I know what impact it has. And I know when I dressed Michelle Obama and how it completely not just changed my career, that's like an obvious given thing, I feel, but the way it impacted people in the country, in the continent, across the thing, and just being like, people would come up to me like, it gives me hope that I can do it too. And that's the thing about sometimes the creativity and art is not just something for pleasure for like an immediate senses, but it is also the impact of like how it can inspire hope in places and people, in nooks and corners and crannies where sometimes the light is so dim that you don't really get to see it, So when Madam VP Kamala Harris, when they asked me to design something for it, it's so gratifying, simply because it's also back home in my part of the world. Sometimes, you hear stuff like that. What are we talking about women's rights? America still doesn't have like a female president. So any proximity to, breaking that ceiling, I know what it means for my nieces and nephews and all those people, right? So I feel extremely grateful. It is the most gratifying. It is the most humbling.
We feel the same about having you on today, Prabal. So.
Oh my God, stop, please. Thank you so much. The questions that you've asked is really thoughtful, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. You provided thoughtful answers in a thoughtful book, so we have a lot of gratitude.
We'll be right back with today's Book Alley.
Well, Brooke, we received this book before we started Book Alley, but I wanted to feature it today because Eleanor Vincent is one of our Berkeley friends, and the book is very powerful. Eleanor's new book is about love, but it's a love story that I actually haven't heard before. Eleanor discovered well into her marriage that her partner was neurodivergent, so she had special challenges to overcome, and her book is an exploration of love on the autism spectrum. So, Brooke, can you tell us more about Eleanor's book? And it's titled Disconnected, Portrait of a Neurodiverse Marriage.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's a late life romance. Eleanor marries Lars, and he is a brilliant database expert, and she believes that their fairy tale will last forever. But then months later, Eleanor finds herself in the COVID lockdown, and her new husband has just lost his job and pulls away from her with these angry outbursts. And day by day, the marriage is fracturing. And so Eleanor's fears about Lars's autistic behaviors basically start to grow, and she struggles to understand him and their growing conflict. And then when each of them gets diagnosed with cancer, another thing to add to the fire here, Eleanor fights for what she hopes is possible in their marriage and encourages Lars to do the same. Lars won't do it, though, and so their communication doesn't improve, and Eleanor has to decide whether to give up her dream of happiness, and if so, how. So, it's a portrait of a marriage and neurodiversity and cancer to boot, so lots of stuff going on in this memoir.
Yeah, it brings up all of those challenges, because it portrays the obstacles that neurodiverse couples must overcome to keep their love alive. In this case, it's also a story told with passion, and one that Eleanor, she invested a tremendous amount beyond what she did emotionally and intellectually to write it. She ended up bargaining away actually a fair share of the proceeds from the sale of their house in exchange for full ownership of her intellectual property. And her estranged husband initially demanded to take, 50% of the royalties from the book. So that's just a reminder that many books aren't written with any sort of peace, but come from a place of deep turmoil that continues.
Yeah, that's always true, especially of these kinds of relationship stories. And you say it's a harrowing love story. It's also a harrowing writing story, right? And what I like so much about this book is that memoir does come in all shapes and forms, and it's a story about life, but also about relationship, about neurodiversity, and a book about these multiple terrible things that happen to the author. And then she's sorting it out and finding her way through it in a way that is ultimately redemptive. So we do recommend that you check out Eleanor's book, Disconnected, because it's also a love story that applies to anyone who's fallen in love and lost that love. And, sometimes speaking to betrayal and all of the twists and turns that these things will take. And speaking of love, Grant, we are in love with our new organization, Memoir Nation, and we've started classes and we have our weekly accountability group going. This summer, listeners, Grant and I I already taught my class, and Grant's is coming up July 22nd, so keep an eye out on that. We have Maggie Smith confirmed for October, Carvel Wallace confirmed for November, Susan Ito just confirmed for September, so we're getting it all locked down. We really want to encourage you to check out our classes page, which you can find on memoirnation.com. Check out the accountability group. You get access to all of this stuff, all of the classes and all of the accountability, and much more that's coming once we get into the fall when you're a Path 3 member. So check out our offerings. If you haven't signed up, please do. We have a free level as well. We so appreciate you making our kickoff fun and successful. It's been awesome so far. And of course, our flagship thing, which is this podcast. We appreciate you listening, and we will see you next week.